Welcome to Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors, where we believe Benjamin Franklin's advice that an investment in knowledge pays the best interest, both in finances and in your life. Every episode teaches you personal finance and long-term investing in simple terms. Now, here's your host, Jesse Cramer.
Hello and welcome to episode 103 of Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors. My name is Jesse Cramer. Today, Christine Benz is joining us. Christine, you might know of her from her Morningstar fame, if you will. Christine is the Director of Personal Finance at Morningstar and the host of the Long View podcast, which features Nobel laureates, A-list economists, and billionaire investors. Christine is a true expert when it comes to the ins and outs of, personal finance general, but especially retirement. And we spend some of today's conversation discussing the interesting things she learned from other retirement experts while writing her book, which is called How to Retire. Before Christine joins us, I'm going to share a few thoughts with you, my own thoughts, and first read one of our customary reviews of the week. This is a 5-star review from Apple Podcasts, where MG Taylor wrote in and said, "I love this pod. Jesse does a great job relaying high-quality personal finance info. I've really enjoyed listening, from hosting quality guests, AMAs, deep dives on technical concepts, or the psychology of money and saving and investing. You demand, Jesse, keep it up." Well, MG, thank you very much for the kind words. Feel free to shoot me an email to jesse@bestinterest.blog, and we will send you a super soft Best Interest t-shirt. Yes, the t-shirts still say Best Interest. They don't say Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors yet. Let me work through some of these Best Interest t-shirts, and then we'll get new PFF LTI t-shirts at some point in the near future. Okay, before Christine joins us to dive into retirement topics, I want to share a few retirement topics of my own, or just a few articles that I've written over the last year or two that have these interesting kind of tangential retirement topics associated with them. So first, I'm going to read from an article I wrote called Some Bets I'm Willing to Make. And this article starts with a true story, a bachelor party that I was a part of, an attendee of. The party decided to go to a casino, and I happily went along for the ride. The behavioral finance nerd in me was ready to witness some pretty interesting, fascinating behavior. I'm not too much of a gambler myself. I maybe occasionally will play poker for entertainment, and it certainly can be entertaining. But gambling, especially at a casino, is not financially savvy. As long as you know that, you'll be okay, albeit most likely a little bit lighter in the wallet. And this particular casino had an engaging loss leader. You know, a loss leader is a strategy where a company has a product that it sells or a service that it sells at a price below its market cost to stimulate other sales of more profitable goods or services, right? I mean, we've all seen it in our lives if we're not familiar with it, where a company will intentionally give away something for free or intentionally give away something for a very cheap price to then encourage you, the customer, to come in and actually spend more money. That's a loss leader. Now, this particular casino offered all of us $15 in free casino credit to all of us new gamblers. The scheme, of course, is pretty cynical. You know, they hope that those free bets will hook you, knowing they know full well that a regular gambler is surely to lose back more than the free $15 over a long period of time. And all it really takes is one true gambling addict to make up for hundreds of free giveaways. Like I said, that's pretty cynical. Now, most of our friends from the bachelor party, most of them went to the blackjack table, where, if you didn't know this as you're listening, the per hand odds of winning at blackjack are about 42% for the player and 50% for the house, and roughly 8% of ending in a tie. And so most of the bachelor party attendees, they went to the blackjack table and they bet their own money on top of the free $15 in credit. My buddy and we kind of cheaped out. We took our $15 free casino cards, we went over to the dollar slot machines, and we basically said, let's push some buttons, let's have some free fun, and we'll do that until the $15 disappears. But we got kind of lucky. My friend Trey, he turned his $15 into $80 of real money. And in the same period, I turned my $15 into about $200. So our $30 of free casino credit became about $300 real dollars. And at that point, once we realized what was happening in front of us, we decided to count our blessings and we walked away. And you know what? We bought a round of drinks and we said, guys, some of the appetizers are on us, you know? Meanwhile, though, the blackjack players, they ultimately played until all of their chips disappeared. A few of them lost a couple $100. They had their fun, but yeah, they ended up losing all their money. And when a few of them learned of our quote unquote success at the slot machines, they felt a little bit aggrieved by our dumb luck. I get it. I understand. But if we look strictly at the financials, I personally see a clear takeaway from this story. Trey and I, or my friend and I, we played, quote unquote, in a way that was literally impossible to lose. As long as we didn't succumb to any impulse to wager our own money, we had a 0% chance of losing money in that casino. Granted, at the end, we got lucky to leave with any sort of gains, right? I think the probability is that we would have taken the $15 free, spent it down to zero, and walked away with nothing. But because we had this agreement, or this shared thought, I should say, that we didn't really want to wager our own money, we knew that there was a 0% chance of us losing. But the way the blackjack guys played, in my opinion, they played in a way that was guaranteed to lose, barring any sort of luck, right? The more hands they played, each hand with a 42% chance that they would win, but a 50% chance that the casino would win, every hand they played increased the probability that they would lose money and walk away at a net loss. And okay, part of this story is that it's true, I'm not the most fun guy at a casino, but I would implore all of you listening to apply a similar idea to your investing, thinking about the odds. Now, the market is not a casino, and that's the first thing we need to talk about. And investing isn't, or at least shouldn't be, gambling. I can understand at times why it feels that way, especially when we hear stories about a GameStop or an AMC or a Tesla or Bitcoin or Nvidia. Big wins, sometimes big losses over very short periods of time. That feels like gambling. But the market as a whole especially is not gambling. It's not roulette. Simply, it represents the ownership of businesses, right? We've talked about that many times here before. A small slice of the global economy that we each own through our stock portfolios. And owning a business is not the same as blind gambling. You're not depending on the fall of the dice or the flip of a card to fall your way. Stock investing involves exchanging money today for the future income stream of that particular business, or in the case of a broad fund of stocks, the future income stream of the global economy. The economy doesn't over or underperform based on dice or cards. Investing in stocks, at least the way I implore all of us to approach it, is not gambling. But the stock market isn't a guarantee either, right? There will be times when we invest on Monday only to see our investments decline in value on Tuesday. In fact, the shorter our investment period, you guys might know this, the shorter our investment period, the more likely we will see losses in our portfolio. Now, I don't want to play blackjack with my retirement. I don't want to make coin flip bets. And the more the odds are in my favor, the more I'm willing to wager, right? The more I'm willing to put on the line. In one of Berkshire Hathaway's annual meetings, this is up on YouTube, Warren Buffett says something akin to, roughly speaking, he goes, quote, "If you give me 5 to 7 odds, we'd be willing to wager a very large sum of money." For what it's worth, 5 to 7 odds is roughly a 60% chance of winning. Now, personally, I don't have enough extra money to make too many bets that are a 60% chance of winning. I'd much rather make bets that are a 90% or a 95% or a guarantee to win. I really want to feel sure that I'm going to walk away a winner. Now, the longer you invest in the stock market, the more likely you will walk away with profits. And that's a wager I'm willing to make. In this article, and the link we will share in the show notes, it shows a great graph that shows total market returns from like the 1870s until basically today, over 1 month and 2 month and 3 month and 5 month and 1 year and 3 year and 5 and 10 and 20 and 30 year holding periods. And the shorter the period, the 2 months and the 3 months and the 4 months, you have roughly a 60% chance of making money in the stock market. But if you're willing to wait 10 years or 15 years or 20 or 30 years, your odds of making money in the stock market, at least historically, have approached 100%, high 80s, mid 90s, all the way up to 100%. Granted, is the future going to mimic the past? Well, of course, that is the trillion-dollar question, but it's a bet I'm willing to make. Now, as of writing this article originally, the S&P 500 was at 5,500. As I'm speaking these words to you right now and talking to you in this recording, the S&P is much closer to 6,000. Now, I ask myself the question, will the S&P 500 be higher or lower in 1 month from now? Now, I don't know the answer to that question. And to be honest with you, I don't care. I don't want to make that bet, and I'm not making stock market bets over the next month. Here's another question to ask yourself. So as of this, as I said, as I'm speaking into this microphone, the S&P 500 is at about 6,000. Will the S&P hit 6,100 or 5,900 next? In other words, will it increase 100 points from now before it decreases 100 points from now? I don't really want that bet either, because both those bets I just described involve short periods of time and or really small changes in the market. 100 points out of 6,000, that's roughly a 2% change in the market. And those bets, at least according to historical data, those are too close to being 50-50 bets. And I don't want to take 50-50 bets with my money. It's too risky for me. And that's why, in my opinion, stock investing is inappropriate over short periods. It's inappropriate if you're only trying to eke out a 1 or a 2% quick hit return. 1 month, 6 months, even out to a few years. Stocks aren't appropriate over those kind of timelines. But then if I think of a bet that says, will the S&P 500 be higher or lower in 10 years? Will it be higher or lower in 20 years or more? Well, now we're starting to talk about bets that I'm willing to make. And it's a pretty sizable bet that I'm willing to make at that. I've got a lot of money on the line. I'm not sure it's going to pay off, right? I'm not positive that it'll pay off, but I really like my odds. Now, will the S&P 500 hit, call it 9,000 before it hits 3,000, right? Will it go 50% up before it goes 50% down? I'm not positive, right? 50% declines in the market do occasionally happen. They have happened before, but they're not too frequent. 50% increases actually are much more common. So when it comes to this particular bet, I'm an optimist here. I like the odds being in my favor. I care about long periods of time and steady compounded returns over those periods of time. And the odds are clearly in the investor's favor, in our favor, when looking at those kind of timescales. Those are some bets that I'm willing to make. All right, the next retirement topic, kind of a quick one, and it comes from an article I wrote in April 2023, and we will link it in the show notes. And the article is simply called, How Long Will You Live? Because I was reading in April 2023, and I saw a headline stating, most people don't understand life expectancy data, which means they don't understand the fundamental aspect of retirement planning. A 20-year retirement is drastically different than a 30-year or a 40-year retirement. Specifically, the headline said, more than half of U.S. adults are jeopardizing retirement preparedness with poor life expectancy knowledge, report says. So let's answer that question right now. How long will you live? Well, as of 2020, the average American male lived for about 75 years. The average American female lives for about 80 years. But wait, there's more. Because imagine you're 55 years old right now and you're planning your retirement. How long should you plan for? Well, if you're a male, you might say, well, about 20 years, right? The average death, 75, minus your current age of 55 yields 20 years. And for females, the answer would be 25 years because you're 55 right now and you die at age 80. But that's actually the wrong approach, because the average death of 75 and 80 years respectively accounts for all deaths at all ages, including all those unfortunate deaths that occur before age 55. Once you've already hit age 55, you've avoided those premature deaths, meaning that your most likely age of death will actually be above average. We can look at the Social Security Administration's actuarial data to see that truth in action, and I have a link to this in the article. So if you want to check it out yourself, go to the show notes. The average 55-year-old male will actually live another 24 years to age 79. That's 4 years beyond the average of all males. And the average 55-year-old female will live another 28 years to age 83. That's 3 years beyond the average age of all females. The true midlife for the average American man is 38 years old, because at age 38, their average remaining life expectancy is another 38 years. And for women, true midlife is age 40, because at age 40, the average life expectancy is another 40 years. Now, maybe you haven't planned much of your retirement and you're sitting down, say at age 65 to figure out your retirement. You have on average 17 more years to live as a man and 20 more years to live as a woman. That's 82 years old in total for men and then 85 years old in total for women. Now, every year matters in retirement planning. The difference between dying at age 74 and 79 and 82, it's a big difference. Not only that, but you might live longer than the average. For example, a 55-year-old American male listening to this right now has the probability of reaching age 75. Well, it's about 64% that he'll reach age 75, about 50% that he'll reach age 80, about 30% that he'll reach age 85, and about 13% that he'll reach age 90. Now, 13% might sound small, but it's a 1 in 8 chance. It's nothing to ignore. In short, as part of your retirement planning, don't look at the average life expectancy for all people. If you're going to look at an average, you should certainly start with the average life expectancy of people your age. Then potentially bake in some conservatism on top of that, because there's a 50% chance you'll live longer than average. Now, when it actually comes to things like when to take Social Security, estate planning, insurance planning, those kind of things, I also highly, highly, highly recommend you factor in your own family history. At the end of the day, there might be no better indicator of your life expectancy than your family history. Yes, environment does play a huge role, so you do want to take care of yourself. But if you have 4 grandparents who lived into their 90s, right? If you have 2 parents who are currently 85 and strong as oxen and you're sitting there at age 50, odds are you're going to live into your 80s and well into your 90s, right? There's just a good chance genetics play a huge role. If you have 2 parents who died prematurely at age 50 and you're at age 55 and you have a bunch of health concerns yourself, I think it's okay to assume that you might live less than the average person, and it's okay to make those assumptions and bake them into your retirement plan. It's a really interesting conversation. It's a little touchy, right? Because it deals with life and death. It deals with our own mortality, and it's never something that we want to think about. But the point being, if you're out there doing some DIY retirement planning, it behooves you to understand your own life expectancy. And the last one today on the topic of retirement planning, from a recent February 2025 article on the Best Interest blog, an article that I titled "The Man Who Never Looked Up." I was hoping that would be a catchy title. I'm not sure if it worked or not, but "The Man Who Never Looked Up." I'm reading and I've just about finished Morgan Housel's recent book titled "Same as Ever." And one of the chapters in that book is called "The Best Story Wins." The idea is pretty fascinating, and it probably makes sense to all of us. The takeaway is that as humans, we promote or discount particular ideas simply because of the story told around that idea, which means that at times we will ignore a great idea because it involved a bad story or because we heard a bad story about it. And at other times we're going to promote a terrible idea because of a good story that we've heard about it. And Housel, the author, Morgan Housel, challenges all of us readers, or for you guys, all of you listeners, to ask yourselves in your lives, who is someone in my life who has the right answer, but I ignore them because they're inarticulate? Or what do I believe is true, but is actually just good marketing? I immediately thought of one of my former engineering colleagues. In our early years working together, I saw him as quirky, obtuse, at times unprofessional, and overall just a bit of an oddball. Over time, though, I realized, yes, while all those things were still true, every room that he was in, he was always one of the smartest people in the room. And okay, call me a jerk, but I think the average person sometimes can confound or confuse a quirky personality with an intelligent personality. Think about like the Big Bang Theory. She's so strange, she must be a genius or something. No, I disagree. Just because someone is weird enough to memorize Wikipedia doesn't necessarily make them intelligent. Hollywood might have taught us to correlate weird with smart, but I don't buy it. This former engineering coworker, though, I know enough to know that he was genuinely brilliant and coincidentally also very quirky. But the problem that he faced was that 99% of our shared colleagues, of our customers, of the stakeholders, they couldn't really get past his strange exterior to see, to understand, and appreciate the genius underneath. His story, as Morgan Housel would say, the way he presented himself, was a perfect example of Morgan Housel's idea that a bad story can discount a terrific idea. Nobody took him as seriously as they should have. I thought of this idea again recently when I spoke to one of my clients. They emailed me with an insurance pitch that they received. The video featured this very affable, well-dressed, well-spoken insurance guy. He explained the untold downsides of all the traditional retirement investing advice, the kind of things that I talk about here on the podcast, while preaching his own incredible upsides of the universal indexed life insurance that he was selling. All the upside, none of the downside, and you get a free steak if you go attend his seminar. Now, it was a great story though, and it was delivered smooth as butter. And I've seen these pitches before. I've seen the math. The math they use is patently untrue. And the language they use is usually overly emotional. It stirs up the audience's deepest fears. You know, if I can scare to you, I can sell to you, that kind of thing. But to the unknowing outside listener or viewer, I'm sure this insurance pitch works. It's a good story. Now, is it dishonest? Of course it is. And if a viewer sees through that lie, well, the jig is up. But until that point, it seems like a conversation worth continuing. And by looking at the size of big insurance out there, all the names that you might have heard of, you see their commercials on TV, there's no shortage of people having those conversations with insurance salespeople. Meanwhile, what's going on the independent fiduciary side of the financial industry? Well, the smart long-term financial planning principles we discuss here are immensely valuable. And I think the stories I share here on the podcast or on my blog, they add some spice, add some flavor to the topics. I hope it's somewhat entertaining to all you listening. But is it exciting? Or is it at times maybe a little boring, a little repetitive, lacking some boogeyman to fear? So I'd like to present to you The Man Who Never Looked Up Ryan had a plan, or so he thought. Work hard, earn more, save later. He wasn't irresponsible per se. He paid his bills, avoided credit card debt. He even put a little bit into his 401k. But retirement, well, that was a problem for future Ryan. For now, Ryan had bigger things to focus on. The next promotion, the next house upgrade, the next family vacation. So he kept his head down, grinding, hustling, living in the moment. And then one day he looked up. He was 55. Retirement wasn't some distant concept anymore. It was right there, staring him in the face. But he wasn't ready. His savings, not nearly enough. His investments, scattered and inconsistent. His timeline, pushed back. Yet again, Ryan had done what so many people do. He spent decades focused on the next step, never stopping to see the bigger picture, never looking up. And what if he had started sooner? If he had invested consistently so that time, not effort, did the heavy lifting? If he built a real plan so his future wasn't just a vague idea? If he optimized his choices so that he kept more of what he earned? The truth about retirement isn't complicated. You don't drift into it, you plan for it. Because someday, you'll look up. The only question is whether you'll like what you see. Here's a quick ad, and then we'll get back to the show. I still remember it was 2019, and a guy from Fidelity came in to speak to my then employer about personal finance in general and about our 401k plan in particular. There were 60 or so of us who attended, mostly 50 plus years old, clearly with retirement on their minds. And nothing against this individual from Fidelity, but unfortunately, the guy just didn't really know what he was talking about. It ended up being a major disappointment. And a bunch of my colleagues afterwards said, in short, man, we're really thirsty for good financial retirement information. Where do we go find it? Now, does that sound true, listeners, for you and your colleagues? Last year, either in person or via Zoom, I spoke to about 800 employees at 11 different organizations, sometimes about personal finance in general, sometimes about specifics of their retirement plans, sometimes about the nitty-gritty details of Social Security and withdrawal planning and retirement math. The point being, if you're interested in inviting me to come talk money to you, to your colleagues, where you work, that is absolutely something I'm interested in talking to you about. Simply drop me an email to jesse@bestinterest.blog and let's start a conversation. And with that, I would like to bring Christine Benz onto the podcast. Again, Christine is the Director of Personal Finance at Morningstar and the host of the Long View podcast featuring Nobel laureates, A-list economists, and billionaire investors. Christine's true expertise is about retirement planning, and today we spend much of the conversation discussing the many interesting things that Christine learned from other retirement experts while writing her book, How to Retire. So without further ado, here's Christine Benz. Well, Christine, thank you for joining the podcast today. And my understanding is that you've been with Morningstar for over 30 years. You're currently the Director of Personal Finance, Retirement Planning, as we said in the intro. And so with that kind of experience and in your capacity, in your role, I'd love to get an understanding for how you view the conversations around personal finance and retirement planning have evolved over the last 30 or 35 years, over your career. How has the public conversation changed?
Thanks so much for having me on. It's really great to chat with you. I know we know some of the same people, and it's great to finally meet you. As far as how the conversation has changed, it may have something to do with my own kind of evolution in terms of the work that I focus on, but I do feel like we have gotten away from focusing strictly on investments, more toward financial planning matters, and that probably does dovetail with kind of how I've chosen to position my career. So I just am getting more questions in the realm of financial planning and retirement planning. But I do think that the conversation has had a healthy shift away from an investment selection only mindset toward one that is more holistic and more planning based. And I think that's all for the better.
Do you find that's true? And when it comes to maybe, this might be a question that has to do with Morningstar's actual consumers and clients, if you will, do you find that to be true from both the side of professionals, meaning the advisors who you're working with at Morningstar or who are reading Morningstar, who are writing in, but also I think to myself, most of my audience, maybe 20% of my audience are other advisors or planners. The other 80% tend to be DIYers who they enjoy learning more about financial planning or just investment management. So do you find that to be what your answer just now? Is that true for both sides of the aisle?
In general, I would say it is, that the advisor community seems to have gotten away from advisor as portfolio manager. And there are still some advisors who, that is what they perceive to be their main value add. But it seems like many other advisors and certainly planners are looking more at holistic planning. In fact, they're increasingly outsourcing the investment selection to a basket of inexpensive index funds or ETFs. So I feel like we've seen a pretty clear migration there in the advisor space. With consumers, it still is a mixed bag. We have a healthy share of engaged individual investors on Morningstar.com who really do like the process of either picking individual stocks or picking individual funds. But there again, I think we've seen many individual investors appreciating the virtue of a low-cost, minimalist portfolio composed of index funds and ETFs. The fund flows very much tell that tale. And I think it's being driven by both types of investors, their advisors as well as individual investors.
So you recently published an excellent book, How to Retire, where you interview 20 subject matter experts. And we'll get into some of these questions later because I have some pointed questions about the book. But I love the fact that basically, by my count at least, 10 of the 20 chapters are about what I'd call maybe more nitty-gritty, numerical, objective retirement topics. And the other 10 are about more subjective, mental, psychological retirement topics. And alluding to what you just said about the more planning focus that the industry has taken over recent decades, I mean, that is that marriage of the numerical and the more mental or the softer psychological. But even before we get into these 20 topics that you dive into, I want to ask you about your parents, Christine, and specifically your dad, and the story that you share in the introduction to your book, How to Retire. Can you tell us that story and kind of how it shaped some of your thoughts on financial planning and family and all these different ideas and how they're intertwined?
Sure. So I was very close to my mom and dad. They've since passed away and was my family's kind of quote unquote first responder. I was the person living in close proximity to my mom and dad, and so was frequently with them and ended up helping them through the last years of their lives when my dad had cognitive decline and needed long-term care. My mom eventually needed long-term care as well. But I was able to be my dad's buddy, investment buddy, throughout his journey. He was someone who always really liked investing, was a stock investor early on, and then eventually a mutual fund investor. And so he and I frequently talked over investment matters. And I think about his transition into not being able to oversee his portfolio was about as smooth as you could get, where he was all in on letting me be on his accounts to see what was going on. Eventually, we transferred it to where I was managing my parents' money and then managing other aspects of their financial lives as well, including bill paying, the stuff that my mom had handled. I think for them, it was, a beautiful kind of transition. They had this trusted adult child who did this stuff for her job. And I think about how rarefied that is, that most people do not have that and really need to put some thought into, well, how do I create a plan that could kind of manage itself for a while if it needed to? How do I find a competent advisor? A whole suite of considerations that should accompany aging and transitioning that portfolio into later into life. And so I wanted to talk more about those things. And that's been something that I've focused a lot of my work on for the past 10 or 15 years, influenced in no small part by that experience with my mom and dad.
Yeah. It's funny you say that, Christine. And I think about my own background, and I don't know if I don't think I've shared this with you, or maybe you found out on your own. I was an engineer. And so my background's in engineering. And I went through this interesting little career change that first involved creating content because I was just interested in investing in personal finance, and eventually led to now I'm working at an RIA. And when I was an engineer and very much a dedicated DIYer, I found this stuff so interesting. I thought to myself, well, I'm sure there are financial planners out there who simply understand the numbers better than I do. And that's their value add. And to some extent, now that I'm in the industry, I see some truth in that. But I was surprised in some of the clients that I'm now working with that it's far more common to hear someone say, no, it's not necessarily about the numbers, or it's not that the client is saying, I don't understand the numbers, Jesse, and you do, and that's why I want to work with you. It's also extremely common to hear, well, if I got hit by a bus tomorrow, my family wouldn't know what to do. So that's why I'm outsourcing it to you. Or here I am, 60 years old and in good health. I don't know if it'll always be this way. So that's why I want to onboard a competent advisor right now. And so it's just that idea that there is more to financial planning than simply the numbers themselves and optimizing the numbers themselves, because it really is about these potential curveballs that life can throw your way. And depending on the severity of that curveball, what you're going to do once it comes.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I am someone who has a financial planner myself, and people are sometimes surprised to hear that. But one of the key reasons that we work with her is that she is a receptacle of all of our information. If something happened to us, to my husband and me, that she would be there for our loved ones to say, okay, what do they have and where is it? And, she could help with that transition. So I do think that's a key benefit, which is not to say everyone needs an advisor all through their accumulation and decumulation years, but it does make sense to have at least someone in place to keep track of what you have. Maybe it's a super trusted adult child who's very financially competent, but I don't know how common that configuration is.
Yeah, I completely agree. Because I can also hear some of the listeners right now saying that's all well and good, Jesse and Christine, but still, you're not going to convince me to hire someone full time. And that is fine. And something we've talked about here before is just the concept of, for example, a life file, or some people call it a death file, of just, that's fine. If you're not going to outsource this to someone on the outside, well, at the very least, whoever your next of kin is, or whoever might be the executive of your estate, you better put everything in order for them so that if something happens, there's a smooth transition and everybody's on the same page after you die. Because those are, again, not to fear monger, but some of the stories that you hear about so-and-so passed away and boy, it was a mess. Cleaning up after that was a mess. And those are the kind of things that ideally we'd want to avoid.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I would also say, Jesse, we don't pay our planner every year. We find that our advice needs are pretty episodic, and we are fine managing our portfolios. I would hope I would be able to do that after all these years. So we're fine managing our portfolios, but we pay her on an hourly basis, and it just works out tremendously well for us. So, which is not to say that model is the right thing for everyone, but for us, it's been a super good fit.
Yeah, no, totally hear you. The most common questions that I get, as far as people seeking out advice, is hourly. The most common questions I get are people seeking hourly advice. And then after that is usually a tie between either annual flat fee versus annual AUM-based fees. But it's funny, the firm that I work for here in Rochester, we don't offer hourly guidance. At one point we did, but strictly from a business decision and, where's our revenue coming from? And do we want to diversify across these, to the listeners who aren't familiar, I'm sure Christine has some experience in this. Like, it takes quite a bit of overhead to dedicate part of your firm to the hourly advice model. It just takes a different amount of overhead to do the flat fee or the AUM model. And we basically said, you know what, we're a solid business on this one fee model, and that's what we're going to stick with. But at the same time, I see the value in hourly advice, especially for someone like me, someone like you, someone like a lot of our listeners who say, I never have that many portfolio questions. It's more about what happens after I die. It's more about how do I do these Roth conversions? And for them, some sort of hourly or flat fee advisor makes a lot of sense. There's a space for all those different kind of advisors. I think of Cody Garrett, who I know you've had on The Long View, and he's been here on The Best Interest. And, he's a terrific example of someone who exclusively works in the hourly space and does a great job for his clients. But on the topic of experts, I don't think Cody is in the How to Retire book, Christine, but
he's not, but I love his work.
Yeah. You found some terrific authors, writers, storytellers to help you put that book together. And I know this is a hard question because it might be like picking your favorite children, but did any of the authors in the chapters really stick out to you as something that you feel like it's just not discussed enough?
A couple, Jesse. And I will say I'm someone who had probably underrated all of the non-financial aspects of retirement planning while I was toying with bucket portfolios and safe withdrawal rates and all that stuff. I think I had not thought enough about the non-financial pieces. So when I think about some of my favorite chapters, those really stand out. Early on in the book, I have a conversation with Laura Karstensen, who's the director of the Stanford Center on Longevity. And so We talk about the role of work in our lives. She has made the point, and she makes the point in the book, that the way we work in this country is all wrong, she thinks, because people oftentimes show up in retirement completely exhausted, completely burned out. They are only able to visualize sitting on the couch. They really don't visualize a fuller retirement. And so she makes the point that we need to retire more often in this country if we can, that there may be times in our lives when young children enter the picture, for example, that might be a good time when someone could pull back from work for a few years, fully engage with child raising, and then maybe step back in. But our culture really doesn't support that model as much. So we talked about that, but the bulk of the conversation was about relationships later in life and how our relationships tend to change a little bit as we age. We tend to self-select into smaller networks of people who we are spending time with. And she leaves the reassuring message that that's actually just fine. You don't want that inner circle to get too small. And there might be sad reasons why that social network gets a little smaller, like people moving away or dying or things like that. But overall, she said that we are becoming more discerning. We are self-selecting into smaller, more satisfying, or a smaller group of more satisfying relationships. So I just really enjoyed all of the aspects of that conversation. She talks about healthy aging, getting outside. Ideally, you would be moving physically outside and with someone. And if you can bring those three things together, all the better. But those factors tend to contribute to healthy aging. So that was one of my favorites. And then the last chapter with Jordan Grummett, who is an author and a leading light in the FIRE movement and has his own podcast. That was another one that I really enjoyed and felt was a good end cap to the book.
Some of Jordan's words about the conversations that he's had with dying patients and the thoughts or the regrets, the excitement, the things that brought people joy during their life as they're dying, or what they reflect on most, versus the kind of things that you and I hear during the prime years of our life. The things that we think might be important aren't always the things that people really reflect on as being important. And I think some of that message is really interesting.
I love that discussion. And I remember telling my husband, I was like, so you know that hospice doctor I'm always talking about? I'm going to make his chapter the last chapter in my book. And he's like, really? A hospice doctor? But the message is so uplifting because Jordan speaks with people at the end of their lives. But his point is you're not at the end of your life, right? You probably have 20 or 25 or 30 years ahead of you. What are you going to do to maximize this time, this remaining time? How will you make sure that in the end, you don't have regrets? So I felt like ultimately it's a really uplifting message, and his whole thing on purpose of making sure you have purpose, but also making sure that you aren't overly sort of fearful, like, oh, I've got to start a foundation or do something really, he calls it big P purpose, something really, sort of with enormity about it. It doesn't have to be that. It can be something more modest, and that's totally fine too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Here's a quick ad, and then we'll get back to the show. Serious question. Why do podcasters constantly ask for ratings and reviews? Yes, they do help highlight our shows to new listeners. They help strangers find us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. It's totally true and a good reason to ask for ratings and reviews. But I have something more important, at least more important to me. I want to know if you like this stuff. I want to know if you like my podcast episodes, my monologues, my guests, the information I share with you and the stories I tell. I want to improve and make your listening more enjoyable in the process. So yeah, I would love to read your reviews. And sure, if you throw a rating in there too, that's great. If you like what I'm doing, please share it with me. It's such a great feeling to read your feedback. I'd love to read your review or see a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Thank you.
What about on the more technical, numbers-based, objective side? I know that's where your experience and your expertise lies, especially maybe on the asset allocation or security selection or those kind of topics. But still, were there any of the authors where you just said, oh, their message is either something that was surprising to you or you just thought was particularly pointed for someone planning their retirement?
Well, I love talking to John Guyton, who is a financial planner in the Minneapolis area and has done some research on flexible spending in retirement. He developed or co-developed what's called the guardrails approach to retirement spending that basically ratchets spending up and down depending on how the portfolio has behaved. And the guardrails kick in to help ensure that in a bad market that the portfolio withdrawals won't have to go too low and really start to cut into someone's quality of life. And they also help ensure that in a good market environment like the one that we've just come through, that even though you are giving yourself a raise, you aren't going crazy. And so that's what the guardrails are about. But I just find him to be phenomenal at explaining things because he works with clients. So he's not just someone who does academic research. He's actually a practitioner. And so I just find him to be extraordinarily good about explaining things. So one point he made on this guardrail strategy and on being flexible with your withdrawals in general is that taking less when the market's down and taking more when it's up is the rare thing that feels like the right thing to do behaviorally that also aligns with what's good for your portfolio. So he makes the point that he's like, spending more feels better than spending less. And pulling money out of stocks feels good when the market's down. Those things are bad for your long-term financial wherewithal. Adjusting your portfolio withdrawals up and down with the market is something that actually feels like the right thing to do and is also the right thing for your investment portfolio. So I loved that whole discussion with him.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because so many of the things that we have to talk about, or so many of the truths of, this investing journey that we're all on, is that we kind of have to come to the understanding that we fight our own human nature. We have to fight our human nature. It's, pick your favorite Warren Buffett or John Bogle quote about what's John Bogle say, when the human instinct is don't just stand there, do something.
Right.
Well, yeah, actually in the investing world, most of the time you're not supposed to do anything at all. You're just supposed to live with the discomfort of a volatile market and just wait it out. But right, the Guyton guardrails are actually something it feels like the right thing to do, and numerically, or when you crunch the numbers, it is the right thing to do. I wanted to ask you specifically, Christine, about one of the chapters. I want to say it's with Jean Chatzky. Mm-hmm. And it has to do with some specific tips and tricks and thoughts that women need to apply in their financial lives that are different. Can you dive into a little bit of that chapter?
Yeah, Jean is kind of a role model to me. Her work has been so influential, and she has been out there in the consumer space, but helping women improve their financial well-being is a huge thrust of her work. And so when I asked her what she wanted to talk about for the book, she was unequivocal. She said, we should talk about what women need to do differently with their money as retirement approaches. What we do know is that women tend to be more likely to be exclusively reliant on Social Security than men. They tend to be undersaved for retirement relative to their male counterparts. And there are a few reasons why. We discussed some of them in the book. In fact, Jean said quite pointedly, I blame childcare or caregiving, because women, of course, are much more likely to be caregivers for their children. And many women want to be caregivers for their children, but that time out of the workforce does reduce the opportunity for retirement savings. And then I think the thing that we're only beginning to get a greater recognition of is that women are much more likely to be caregivers for their elderly parents than men, which is not to say some sons don't help a lot. They do, but women, when you look at the data, are very often unpaid caregivers. Often adult daughters are unpaid caregivers, and that can reduce their retirement savings contributions. It can also just limit their work opportunities. It may require that they pull back from paid work to help with the parents, and those things can work against women with respect to retirement savings. So Jean made a couple of points. One is that women, their earnings tend to peak a little bit earlier than men. So early in their careers, they need to hit it hard in terms of retirement savings. They also need to make sure that they are investing in an age-appropriate way. So investing aggressively, having enough in stocks. And then women need to be a little bit more mindful about long-term care than men. They both probably do, but women are more likely to need paid long-term care than men. And so that necessitates having a plan for that, whatever that might be, whether it is buying insurance or setting aside a long-term care fund apart from insurance, or for women with very constrained resources, it may be relying on government-provided care. But having a plan there is super important.
That's really interesting. And it reminded me, Christine, when we were planning for our daughter, we've got a 7-month-old. I remember writing a few articles and I think recording a couple episodes just about I was going through it. So what are all the things that a young parent needs to prepare for when it comes to financial planning? And one topic that came up that I just hadn't thought of it before, hadn't heard of it, but it totally made sense, is this idea that from an estate planning point of view, or it's almost like a post-nuptial agreement point of view, is depending on what path the parents take, it is far more often that the woman, the mother, might take more of a caregiving role while the father might continue to work, or at the very least, whatever the situation is, sometimes one partner takes on more of a caregiving role than the other, whichever one it is. And for that caregiving partner, they're going to contribute far less to their own retirement. They're going to earn far less. And there might come a point in the future when, depending on, again, and this is going down a bit of a rabbit hole, but let's say in the unfortunate event that couple ends up getting divorced. Well, depending on the arrangement that they have in place, is one partner going to leave post-divorce with potentially much more assets or a much larger retirement account or whatever it may be as a function of the fact that they had different caregiving roles? And basically what some articles that I read discussed is partners should have that discussion because oftentimes, as you and Jean discussed, the woman does take on more of a caregiving role. And it's almost this idea of, do we need to put something in place? Do we need to come to some sort of financial agreement just to make sure that woman doesn't end up getting screwed over in some way because she's the one who's taking a step back from work? And I suppose the way you just described it is that arrangement can express itself in other ways too, whether it's the caregiving for elderly parents or just the career sacrifices that women often make more than men, and some of the long-term financial repercussions as a function of that.
Yeah, no, it comes down to communication, really, very much so. If the couple are kind of a healthy, intact couple, it's well worth having those conversations. And then, unfortunately, in the case of divorcing couples, it's super important for the spouse, the female partner, to make sure that she's getting good advice on which assets she should go for in the divorce. Oftentimes, the way it works out is that the female partner, who's often the caregiver for the children, gets the house and less of the investment assets. And that may be exactly what she wants, but it will tend to leave her with fewer retirement assets. So getting some good financial advice as part of that divorce process, I think, is very much a key point to make.
Speaking of couples, though, we can obviously hope that many couples enter retirement perfectly, blissfully happy, and their marriage is intact. But still, were there any interesting thoughts that came out of the research for the book or the interviews for the book when it came to partners who are retiring? Maybe they're not retiring at the same time, or maybe they're not exactly on the same page for what they want to do in their retirement. Are there any chapters that we can point listeners to, or any experts when that had really good thoughts on that topic?
Well, I loved our mutual friend Fritz Gilbert's thoughts on navigating retirement with his wife. He shared a really poignant story of his wife having been the primary caregiver for her mother, who I believe had dementia and then passed away, and how they had not planned on her retirement quite as much as they had Fritz's. Fritz had a traditional career in the office. And so they, knew that his retirement was impending, but I think that they weren't equally prepared for sort of the life dislocation that would happen with her as part of her mom passing away and those caregiving obligations going away overnight. And I'm sure there were aspects of that were a great relief, but also, an element of a loss of identity. Here's something that I did at one point in my life I no longer do. I'm effectively retired from that work. So he discussed that, which I thought was thought-provoking. And he also just talked about embarking on retirement with another person. He called it he time, she time, and we time. Don't assume that you will just be hanging out together constantly during retirement, that you need things that you pursue independently. You need things you do together, some shared interests. So I thought that he did a great job of discussing his real world experience navigating retirement as part of a couple.
Very good. The last question I wanted to ask you, Christine, or I haven't even thought through this question, to be honest with you. So let me see if I can navigate my way through it. Maybe it's more of a statement, and I'll start with the fact that when people ask me for a lot of the podcasts that I consume, The Long View is always at the top of my list, which is hosted by you and Jeffrey Patak. Sometimes you'll have a guest, a host come on. And one of the reasons why is because I feel like you guys, quite simply, you guys get world-class guests and you ask them very interesting questions about what makes them world-class and, whatever their expertise is in the financial or economic world. So I suppose maybe the question can simply be, how did it start? How do you manage to get these guests to come on? And then how do you not stumble over your words like I've been stumbling over my words today when you're sitting in front of, a Nobel laureate or something like that?
Well, Jesse, thank you so much for listening to the podcast. I really appreciate it. We've been doing it since pre-COVID, so like 2019 or something. And it's just been a really fun diversion from my job where we have these great, deep conversations with thought leaders. In terms of getting the guests, recruiting the guests, I think just, reading, listening to other podcasts, those are great sources of ideas about who to ask. Increasingly, I've been delving into some non-financial podcasts. So we had Charles Duhigg, who did a great book called Super Communicators. We've had a few totally non-financial guests on the pod, which have been really fun. And then some sort of psychology types as well, because we know the intersection between psychology and money is huge and rich terrain. And then we have, in terms of just making us sound our best, that's our engineer, George Cassidy, is a phenomenal producer. And I think he really nicely cleans things up for us.
Awesome. Well, if our listeners today, if they either want to check out The Long View, if they want to go get a copy of How to Retire, Christine, or maybe if they just want to reach out or follow you on social media, something like that, where can we point them to?
So I'm on X. I'm also on LinkedIn, and I'm a fixture on Morningstar.com, writing articles and doing videos. That's really my main job. And so people can find me there as well.
Awesome. Well, Christine Benz, thank you so much for stopping by the Best Interest Podcast.
Thank you so much, Jesse. It's been my honor.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors. If you have a question for Jesse to answer on a future episode, send him an email over at his blog, The Best Interest. His email address is jesse@bestinterest.blog. Again, that's jesse@bestinterest.blog. Did you enjoy the show? Subscribe, rate, and review the podcast wherever you listen. This helps others find the show and invest in knowledge themselves. And we really appreciate it. We'll catch you on the next episode of Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors. Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors is a personal podcast meant for education and entertainment. It should not be taken as financial advice, and it's not prescriptive of your financial situation.